He is the former Chief Storytelling Officer, 8 books on storytelling, and is really internationally recognized for his organizational development, and has even received awards for that. Terrence, it's lovely to see you here. But in the chat right now, I will leave a link to download the Russian version of the slides. So feel free to download it and look through it during Terrence's talk. Terrence, it's all yours. I'm just here listening in pure joy.
Oh, wonderful. And please, any presentation should be highly interruptible. And Artem, I also extend that to you. When you see a really fascinating question that is really relevant to what I'm speaking at the moment, please interrupt. We'll have questions at the end. I'll keep it tight so that there is plenty of time. But I encourage conversation throughout, even in a short presentation.
Awesome.
You know, there's something about storytelling of this session, and it's about stories happening to leaders. And we see this water, and we understand that as a leader, we're in the midst of waves and movement and all sorts of things. But in the beginning of this presentation, I'm going to go slow to go fast, which is to say that as storytellers, beginnings are really, really important, because in a sense, as storytellers, we're always in the beginning of the middle of a never-ending story. So I'm going to say that again, because it's something important about stories in that we think of them as discrete units, and yet we're really in a sea of stories that surround us at all times. And as leaders, we're always trying to help people to make sense of what they are experiencing and putting boundaries around them that have clean beginning, middles, and ends, and that connect one story to the next. But yet, as we think about ourselves as human beings and how we go about the world and find meaning and give meaning to others to help them through stability, change, learning, growth, all of the things that in organizations are critical to our success, we are always in the beginning of the middle of a never-ending story. So we're going to work for a moment with this metaphor of the ocean and of water. We're going to take a glimpse. I did a little research, and I wish I could actually say them in Russian for our Russian, a large portion of our audience in this global conference, and our hosts, who are Russian. But I found some Russian proverbs. And then, of course, how could we begin any story presentation, even if it's a business one, without an actual story? So I'm going to do those 3 things in the beginning, and then we'll get into the meat, where we'll look at some experiences. We'll look at 3 additional ways that we can think of the leader as the center around which stories are happening and how they have to navigate that. And then I'm going to share with you some experiences as chief storyteller at Accenture and some of the things that we learned along the way. And that's when we'll get into some real practical material that I hope will be very relevant to many of you. So throughout this conference, I hope that you'll hear 3 core things about storytelling. And you can see that even in today's lineup, and all of these speakers that Artem and the whole team there have put together are truly at the cutting edge and have been doing deep story work for a long time. So we're very fortunate, and I look forward to many of the presentations. But one thing you're going to learn is the importance of listening. Stories are more about listening and eliciting than they are about telling. So it's really a shame that we all call it storytelling. In fact, when I wrote my first book, I said story making, because this whole word of storytelling is really almost a misnomer in many ways. The second thing that you're going to likely hear a lot about is intention. So as leaders, what is our intention for telling the story? And if your intention is about control, you're going to be really disappointed about what storytelling actually can do for you. It's not to say that storytelling can't help you message, can't help you brand, can't help you position things. However, the intention with which we tell stories is really more about propagating. So if you remember my opening quote, stories are always about the beginning of the middle of a never-ending story. So when you put that into reality, you realize that our intentions are not so discrete, that we don't use stories often in the same fashion that we use traditional forms of communication where I need to be very explicit. So you'll see I'm going to model this right from the beginning by using a lot of metaphors and analogies and what might sometimes feel even imprecise language. And the last thing I really want you, and this is a core part of the wisdom that I've garnered through a lot of hard lessons learned, but story is about others and not ourselves. So storytelling succeeds in its deepest and truest purpose when it has actually, believe it or not, some selflessness to it. So my interest in listening, my interest in eliciting, gathering the stories of others and then helping them to make sense and crafting them into a vision of who and how we are. So I want to move to these Russian proverbs, and I looked these up, and I wish the Russian translator, I'm sure, will say them in their native way. But the first one I found was that relates to water and this theme that we're working in for this session is the devil lives in the still water. So here we are in this ocean, and everything is churning all around. But isn't it eerie if the water is completely placid, completely calm and still? What's down underneath that? Is it something nefarious? Is it something that could come and erupt that we're not paying attention to, that's going to surface in a way that won't be good for the organization? I like this next one. I think actually, by the way, the more literal of the Russian on that is still water runs deep. Beware of a silent dog in still water. That was what I found in terms of the meaning. Here's the next one. The person who falls in water will hold on to the foam to save himself. So here we are. I will be moving past this first slide, I promise you. But here we are in all of this foam and all of this water. And the people in your organization are constantly trying to surface to catch their breath and hold on to the foam of all of this churning water. How about this one? Once you have fallen into the water, you're not scared of water anymore. So it's like the child that puts his foot into the water. It's too cold. I don't want to get in. I have my fears. I have my reservations. I'm not sure of this experience. But then I get pushed into the water. And many of us in organizations, as we face the challenges day in, day out, are really pushed into the water, right? So once we fall into that water, there's something about being in the movement of the water that takes away a certain amount of the fear. We may be dealing with uncertainty, but we're in it whether we want to or not. And a lot of us are feeling that globally as we live through this pandemic in very unusual times. And lastly, I love this one. Water never loses its way. So if you're in the water and the water's not still, thank heavens, because you really don't want it to be still, going back to that first proverb, then water has a way of finding its way. And that's really, as leaders, what you're doing is you are helping people to find the way. So if you see yourself as in the middle of all of these crests and these troughs and the movement of water, you're a mirror. People are looking at you as the leader. And as you are going through the organization and things are happening all around you, you really are the eyes and ears that people are expecting to give them a reflection of what their experience means and how to get through that experience. So I want to end my big beginning here with a story, and perhaps. By the way, I want to point something out. I did one of the first principles of storytelling that's really critical that we're even going to talk about when we get to Accenture, which is I made some kind of very crude effort, not being able to speak Russian, but to go into the wisdom of Russian proverbs, which I was really just enamored with, just fell in love with the other day when I went through this exercise. And what I'm doing is putting a big piece of our audience, our hosts, first by working in something that's specific to them. I am not a Russian expert or know anything about Russian proverbs. However, I wanted to both appreciate and draw from that wisdom as a way of making connection. So connection is really, really important part of storytelling. So I hope I've modeled that. I'm going to model something else now by telling you a story that on the surface you may scratch your head and go, what does this have to do? And when are we getting to the case study? And where's the practicality? Hang on, it all comes, I promise you. But I was talking to Artem the other day, and Artem, and I excuse if I've butchered your name. He said, I want to go on a quest for truth. And so his wife, who I know is from just his own anecdotes, has been incredibly supportive of this major undertaking of putting the conference together, packed him a beautiful lunch with some caviar and all of his favorite foods. I don't even know if he likes caviar, but all of his favorite foods, whatever those might be, and he heads off. And he says, the first place I should go is to the United States of America. I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., because I bet there's truth there. Well, sadly, he did not find truth there. So he said, I've got to go to the Kremlin. I'll find truth there at the Kremlin. And he shows up at the Kremlin, and sadly enough, he can't find truth there. So he goes, I know. I'm going to have to go to the Himalayan mountains. I'm going to go climb to the highest peak on Earth. I'm going to go to Mount Everest. And there I'll find truth. Well, he got up to the mountain. He's standing up on the top, can barely catch his breath, and can't find truth anywhere on top of Mount Everest. So as he's making his way down the mountain, he's a little sad, and he looks to his left and he sees a sign, and it says, truth lives there. So Artem heads down the path and goes towards this little rocky, very narrow path, and it's cold and there's ice all around, and finally he gets to this little hutch, and on the hutch, on this little house in the middle of nowhere, it says, truth lives here. Artem is so excited. He's like, I've arrived. It's here. Wonderful. And so he knocks on the door, and slowly the door opens. And out peers this woman. Oh, but she's not a woman. She is just a hideous, old, ugly, decrepit hag with things coming out of her eyes and very gross hair and just the most hideous, awful looking thing you've ever seen. And she says with a sweet voice, yes, dearie, what do you want? It goes, and Archim's like, oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I think I found the wrong place. I was looking for truth. And she goes, yes, you found it. Come on in. So Artem spent quite some time with her and was amazed at all of the wisdom. Truly, he had found truth, and he was so excited to learn everything he could. And he said, "Look, Lady Truth, I must go. You are so old and have so much, and I could stay here forever with all that you have. But I'm filled up to the brim. I need to go and share some of this." And so he says, I'm going to leave, but tell me what I should tell them about you. And she leans over, and there is this old woman with all of her ugly, hideous, gnarly face. And she says, well, dearie, tell them I'm young and tell them I'm beautiful. Okay. You can think about that and think about what that might mean for all that we're about to do. Okay, so let's move past this first metaphor of water, and let's go now to the beach. And we're at this beach, and as a leader, I want to offer you now 3 metaphors of how to think of yourself as a story leader where stories are happening all around you. And the first image I have for you here is the leader as like a rock balancing things, the leader as a fulcrum. So what is a fulcrum? Well, a fulcrum is a pivot point. It's something around which a lever could turn. So if we had a wench or something like that, it's acting as something that places force and balance to things. Here we're seeing a fulcrum act as a balance, and a complex balance. You'll notice I was very purposeful in picking this image because it's not just one piece of wood and 2 rocks balanced on top of one rock in the middle, but actually it's a complex set of pieces of wood and rocks that somehow are all in balance with one another. So as a leader, you're in the center of things, you're in the center of the situations, the things that are happening in your organization, and you're meant to bring some kind of balance to people, because people are trying to find their way through all of these things. So take that as one image. Let's continue with our imagery, and let's start on the left-hand side of the slide, and let's now see ourselves in all this moving water and take on the leader as a buoy. So a buoy is kind of floating in the middle of what could be very tempestuous, big stormy seas. They could be, they don't have to be stormy seas, but we're using that for purposes of understanding the dynamics in organizations. And as a story leader, as you are finding these things, you, like a buoy, you've got gauges on you. You've got all your metrics. You've got temperature and the salinity of the water and the movement of the water, measuring the size of the swell and the waves and all of this activity that is part of the power of the water, the power of the organization, the power of the people that are working towards your organizational goals. And you're trying to stay afloat, and people are looking to you, and sometimes their vision is obscured, meaning they can't see you because you're going up and down, and sometimes they're able to more clearly see you. But as a leader, and as you're discovering the stories of the organization around you, you're acting as a sense maker. So right below this image, you'll see a number of dots, and these dots represent network, and we all now know the power of network. We know the power of our social networks. We know the power of the computer networks that enable us. Like, here I am sitting in Monterey, California, early on Monday morning, and I'm able to share with the entire globe, this presentation. How marvelous is that we live in that type of world? But as a leader, you are connecting the dots for people, and that's an important thing for you as a leader, to see that as you take other people's experiences and move through the organization, it's your job as a story leader to narrate, to connect all of the various different things that you're observing and hearing and put them into some continuity, so that this network of meaning is giving people some buoyancy in all of this, all of these unknowns, and they're finding for themselves a place in that. The second, on the right-hand side, we have, again, keeping with our imagery of water, and I want to point out again, from a storytelling perspective, analogies do not have to be perfect. It's not about the precision. It's about the richness. It's about the evocative. What I'm trying to do is elicit through your own imagery rich associations that they then become the story. And that's what I'm doing as a sense giver. You'll notice that even though the lighthouse is out there on a rock and the waves are crashing all around it, it's got lights. And right below the picture of the lighthouse is a picture of a stage. And you as a leader are on the stage at all time. People are looking to you for you to have answers, for you to have what they need in the organization. And it's lots of lights that are shining. So those lots of lights are the stories of all the people in the organization around you that actually shed light on what's really going on. So your job is to elicit and to observe the stories happening around you as you then become a sense maker that's narrating it. In the middle, you'll see the loop of the 8 to represent that this is a continuous cycle that's sort of going around itself over and over in the organization in a tireless way, which again goes back to our opening quote: you're always in the beginning of the middle of a never-ending story. So from all of this, as a leader, you're helping people to find the insights from the experiences of the stories. So just like DNA, where there are these 4 amino acids and everything has a bond, and from the combination of these 4 nucleotides, these amino acids, great diversity of expression occurs. And so when we talk about trying to, again, control stories and wanting a specific story to be repeated over and over again, that's really not the true power of storytelling. I may share a well-crafted narrative, meaning a collection of stories. Notice I use the word narrative to now talk about when I put many stories together. Don't just try to tell you one big story. I may actually use that as a way of eliciting and helping you to find your own place in the story. So here's another analogy to help you think about what happens to people in this network of stories that you're narrating and trying to create sense from. And that is that a pitchfork that musicians use. So I take a pitchfork and I strike it against a table and it begins to vibrate. Now, what happens if I take a second pitchfork and I also, and I don't strike it and I bring it near the pitchfork that is vibrating? The second pitchfork begins to vibrate at the same frequency, on the same wavelength as the first pitchfork that I struck. So people's responses to story brings about synchronization. So really, we're not about control with stories, we're about synchronization. We're about helping others as they have their experiences in their organization, begin to vibrate around the core of the organization's missions, its goals, its profit motives, whatever type of organization you're working in and whatever those goals are. It's about helping others to find their place in that and bring meaning to it. And that is really the power of it all. And if you think that stories, we all love movies, we love television shows, we love great novels, and those are certainly we learn a lot from that type of storytelling. Stories that do have clean beginning, middles, and ends, and that have big story arcs, and you'll hear about, I'm sure, during this conference, the hero's journey, which is a fabulous way to craft to kind of well craft a story. And yet, again, I want to emphasize those things we talked about in the beginning. The fact that stories are more about listening and eliciting. Stories really require us to have an intention of bringing others into the story, not just us dominating the story and controlling the stories. And that stories ultimately are about others, not ourselves. I only share a story, maybe from my own perspective, as a way of grabbing you, of helping you, of encouraging you to do what Václav Havel talks about, which is that our true power lies in reflection. So stories is about remembering, putting things back together, and it is that place of memory and reflection where the DNA, those insights, truly occur. So as a story leader, there's an English expression which says, actions speak louder than words. And since people in the organization are watching you, they're not only listening to you, but they're watching you. And they're watching to see, what are you listening to? How are you navigating all of the incongruent, all the chaos, because often one set of stories or stories that you hear often conflict against another set of stories. So how do you find your truth? How do you find your true north? How do you navigate through that? So leaders enact their intentions. So the best leaders are not just telling their stories, but in their commitment to eliciting and listening deeply in their organization, they are enacting the truest form of storytelling, which is they are listening as a means of connecting people to the organization, to themselves, and to one another. So realize that it's not whether you're a great storyteller that you can get up and perform a story. You'll see that there's a huge diversity to the styles in which people even tell stories. The story itself is the power, not myself as a performer. Now, if I'm going to be a motivational speaker, then yeah, you better be a great storyteller. So let's get into a little bit of Accenture. Accenture is a $450,000 system integration company, very, very diverse, global, Really amazing, amazing organization, and I was thrilled to have spent some time there. And I had gone there with the intention of myself of scaling my story work. So I had been in boutique practice for myself for a long time, and had an opportunity to come in and actually help them form. This was before I was chief storyteller. I was going to do a lot of change management work for large cultural change efforts. Now, after a while, I found out that really the organization wasn't quite prepared for some of that work, and didn't know if I was going to stay in the organization. When suddenly a problem in the organization became really, really apparent, and the problem that the organization was facing was for large scale sales. This was like 100 US $1 million deals and above. The leaders were really having a hard time selling those types of solutions. And part of it was because they were trying to come in a very traditional way and say, hey, we're the experts. Here's the solution. Here's what we know about the industry, and here's what you ought to do. And they weren't really about engaging and helping people to make sense and connect the dots and all the kinds of things that we were talking about. So they were losing a lot of these sales, and they needed something special. And I said, I think storytelling could really help you. So I somehow sold this idea inside of the organization and was named chief storyteller. And really, we came out of the gates with kind of three basic offerings for these global senior managing directors and managing directors who are responsible for growing the value of the firm and selling these large transactional deals. And I'm looking at the time, and I am being sensitive, and I'm going to take about 2-3 more minutes, maybe 3 minutes if I may, Archam, because I know we have a hard stop at around 7:40 or whatever time that is in your. But I'll be sensitive to time. So we set off with doing three basic things. Providing facilitation for clients where we did some story discovery work, some coaching of these leaders to give them the skills that they needed to be effective stories. So, and I'll show you this model in just a second, but what are the behaviors of an effective leader who needs to navigate with stories? And lastly, some story architecture, which was basically doing some marketing and some communication work as we were coming up with solutions for clients and helping them to put those into more storied formats. Now, it was my first day, literally, on the job, and I get a call from someone who had wanted some help with, they were selling an extension. So they were already doing some work with a very large retail client, and they were trying to sell some additional work, just to add on to what they were doing. And they had a meeting, and they were really frustrated because they hadn't been able to sell this work, which to them was really needed by the client. It wasn't even just trying to get some extra value out of the client. It really was something that needed to happen. And I said to them, well, who were you talking to? And they said, well, we were talking to the chief marketing officer and some other very, very senior people. I said, well, let me see what you brought them. And one of the key things that they brought them was this diagram, this use case, which I said, well, how did they respond to this? And they said, well, they kind of all nodded their head and all seemed like they were on board and saw the value of the work. But it's been 2 months and we can't get any traction. We haven't been able to do. I said, well, the reason, I said, let's try something completely different, because this demonstrated your expertise, but it certainly wouldn't have gotten me all excited and getting ready to sell. So I said, what if we did something like this? Because if you've got the chief marketing officer and you've got people who are non-technical, they already believe you've got the technical expertise, but they need a way to talk about this work if they have to go and get the support for it themselves. They don't directly hold the key to the money pot. Yes, they're key decision makers, but it has to be done across multiple silos of the organization and with lots of influencers. So how are you going to influence them? How can you give them something? How can you give them a story to tell? So we created this simple cartoon, which basically told the value of the work. Well, the result was they signed that extension like 2 weeks later after he went back and shared something which was of a more storied nature. So it told me that organization was really primed, that they really didn't know how to give people stories, how to help organizations themselves find stories that would potentiate the message and move through the organization. So I created a real simple framework for them, one that I'd used with all my clients throughout my history, and that was for these leaders to realize that stories inform, connect, and emote. And those are the 3 basic things. And in doing that, I'm just going to push ahead to again, something that I said at the beginning, that stories are about others. So if you're going in, even in an influence situation like sales, and if you're doing change management, you're really doing sales at the core, but you can't think of it as traditional communication, something that I shared at the beginning as well. And this quote from Cicero, a Roman philosopher, which is all about, can I stand in the shoes of others? Do I know what they're thinking, feeling, and am I demonstrating that I can speak their words? And so one of the core things that we did, this is really bringing me right to the end, and we'll get to your questions, is taking that framework of stories, inform, connect, and emote. Help these leaders begin to focus on these 4 core story areas and how stories could be used for informing, connecting, emoting, and across these 4 basic dimensions. And that was, our clients at Accenture needed to hear our own personal stories. They needed to know why we cared about the work that we do. They obviously needed to hear some of Accenture's stories, which is, where have we been? Where are we going? What are we doing to create the future? So not so much like beat the chest, we're great, and here are all the great things that we've done, and if you're not using us, you're going to fail. But really more about, how are we navigating the own future, and what have been our experiences, and what have we learned, and what is it like? What does it feel like to work with us? And then, of course, the stories about what we've done for others. And lastly, and most importantly, really, what do we know about you? What are your stories that, when we form them all up and we collage them, we put them in relationship to one another, give us some insight as to why this future vision, this thing that we all imagine could be helpful to the organization, could be done. And one last slide, which really is core to kind of the work that we did, is we rolled out story coaches globally to work with deal teams as we worked on Accenture's culture, which they wanted to become a more human workplace. And so stories obviously had a role in playing and connecting people heart to heart, human to human. And that was, we worked with my behavioral model, which is just more in depth than what we can go into, but you'll certainly find more of that out on my website. But we coached leaders using this behavioral model, which is to say, yes, we think of storytelling in the center about selecting stories, performing those stories, doing things that model, but yet what's critical for the behavior of a successful leader in storytelling is story listening. So what are we doing to observe the stories around us and all of this water? How are we eliciting the stories of others? What are the techniques and behaviors for doing that? And what are the different ways in which we listen? And listen has lots of nuances to it beyond which we can get into at this moment. And then how are we reflecting? So going back to the Václav Havel quote, reflecting and helping others to make sense. Remember, we give sense to make that network, to help others make sense in all of that water. So on that, I'm going to pause and let Archam kind of come forward with questions.
David, thank you so much, Terrence. This was awesome. And I really loved your way of showing this great fable of the truth. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
We are actually having some great questions in the chat. Let me read them to you. And Andre and Gatra are saying this in sync. How experts can understand the context of the listeners and develop the skill of standing in the shoes of the others.
Yes. So I'm going to use another analogy. I was a scuba diver, and one of the things that amazed me when I was first learning to dive was actually the dive instructor. So here is a dive instructor that has on all of this life-saving paraphernalia, and yet you've got 15 students in front of you who are frightened out of their, very frightened because it's the first time that they've been under the water, and I dive in cold water, so we have lots of gear on. And to answer the question succinctly, that dive instructor had to forget themselves. So one of the most important things as a leader in walking in other people's shoes is, as we carry all of this life-giving paraphernalia, we know a lot about the organization, we know a lot of data, which is critical to our success as a leader in an organization. We have to somehow forget it and make people feel comfortable that wherever they are at, and whatever story they have, even if we've heard it before, by the way, is the most important thing in the world. So, some people call that mindfulness, and mindfulness is another way of thinking about it, but it's a power of observation and creating a space. Story is living, and you're always creating a space of care and the intentionality. Here's intention again. The intention that I care about what you're experiencing. And when people feel that, they naturally open up, and that allows for us to hear their stories. And from that, we may learn all kinds of things, unexpected.
Fantastic. Learn to forget who you were. That's a really externalizing position. That's like, understanding where your boundaries. Wonderful. Thank you. There was another great question here by Paul. He wanted to know is how can leaders best portray stories visually in this modern day era of the importance of social media? So maybe any clues on that?
Wow, rich question. I'm gonna jump on something that is almost counterintuitive. Storytelling is great because of its nonlinear nature. So rather than give you the obvious answer of, hey, if you find a really good metaphor, visual image, and I tried to model that a little bit, that can tell a story. Of course, infographics, of course, video, right? And you'll probably hear some good advice from other speakers on all of those things. But I want to jump to something that's counterintuitive, and that is because stories are nonlinear. If you can find nonlinear tools and techniques, including video, we're not using interactive video effectively yet in business. It's been around for a while. There are some platforms and tools for creating interactive video, but when you allow people to lead themselves through the story, and you don't see the story as having just a single beginning, middle, and end and one path, but this multi-path. If you find the tools and the platforms and craft your stories so that they become non-linear, and it's a network, a constellation of stories, and do that visually, that's the most powerful form of visual storytelling.
To sum it up real quick, to not only focus on one story, but give us like a narrative, a constellation of it. Some.
Yes. Story fragments and giving people ways of navigating that in more than one path.
Perfect. Very clear. Thank you so much. One more question from Lucas there. He asks, what would be the most important to consider as a leader when storytelling to your people? Business goals or culture, behavior, or maybe both?
Both.
Easy one, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is hard, because as leaders, we only have a limited bandwidth, right? You only have so much time. You're one person, and yet you're such a central person that people are looking to. And where do you focus your concentration? One of the things that I coach leaders on the most is to trust their instincts, to learn that even if you go in with a certain set agenda, that you have to really be able to pivot. The best leaders are the ones that pivot, The best leaders are the ones that often abandon the story that they thought they were going to tell. And now I'm using story in a broader sense. Hey, I knew I needed to get across these 3 key things. But you know what? I walked into the room and I was talking to these 3 people, and it became clear to me that this area, the marketing department, was in a whole other space than I thought they were. And so this now is really where I need to direct and facilitate and orchestrate the conversation. Because really, as a leader, it should be you're using the stories to jumpstart conversations, not to dominate
Mhm. Great. This power level similarity, great thought here. Thank you so much. I have one more question for you, actually, from Brigitta, and we will be wrapping with the next question I have in storage for myself. What is your one recommendation, she writes, to empower managers to dare to lead?
I'm
through
sorry, one more
stories?
time. For some reason, it broke up. I didn't hear the full question.
Yes, of course. I guess it's the helicopters here in Korolov. I don't know. Maybe something going on, but all right. So here's it is one more. What is your one recommendation to empower managers to?
Oh, great questions. Trust yourself. So you have to empower yourself and authenticity, and you have to be willing to take risks. You have to also be willing to not have the one story or the perfect story that's going to reach everyone. And I think as leaders, we often are concerned, and rightly so, about getting as many people to come along with us. So a lot of the work and coaching that I did was giving these very senior people who were very successful, but giving them permission to actually take risks and to bring more of themselves, as opposed to the polished person that they had become and that they had been seen as. And storytelling does allow us to really open up and, in some sense, be vulnerable. Appropriately vulnerable.
Absolutely, really, that is absolutely what I was anticipating. And all right, I have really enjoyed this too much, and I'm in a way I'm even sorry that we need to wrap up to the next speaker, but I'm not going to offend anyone on our lineup. So, last time we met for an interview, you really got me to my heart when you were answering one of my key questions. On the interviews, I always ask, if one thing makes a great story different from a good story, that one thing is. And I still, to this day, remember that your answer was love. And it really shook me immensely. And actually, I have one more phrase I want you to continue today as a speaker, because we are investigating in the world of story and leadership and their intersections. So here's the quote I want you to end. Imagine that Her Majesty's story came alive and was to teach leaders one thing and one thing only. If she was alive and she was to teach leaders that one thing would be:
you are where you are, doing what you need to do. Do it, and do it with love, and receive the unconditional love, because you are exactly where you are.
Perfect. I love your lessons on presence and humanity. Thank you so much. Guys, for all of you, that was Terrence Gargiulo, an amazing consultant and the perfect human being, a really alive person who visited us today. You can also click the links in the chat to contact Terrence. Let's just say our thanks and press the fire in the down right corner to embrace how much we got out of it. It was really an awesome speech, Terrence. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.